The prairie should have been silent. Just whined through the grass, a creak of wagons, maybe the bark of a dog far away. But in the spring of 1873, silence betrayed something heavier, an orchard where the earth had been disturbed too often, too recently. A shovel struck dirt, then bone. Another struck, and another. What rose from that soil was not a harvest, but a catalog of vanishings. The missing men, the lost travelers, the families who'd walked into the horizon and never returned. Their skulls bore the same story, caved in by the same blunt hand. The neighbors called the land cursed. The newspapers called the killers the demon family. But the name that endured was simpler, crueler, almost mocking in its bluntness. The Bloody Benders, a family of innkeepers who turned supper into a sentence, a smile into a trap, a chair at their table into the last thing their guests would ever know. It's been more than a century, and still the prairie whispers their name, not because of what they did, but because of how they disappeared. It started with the floorboards, loose planks, creaking where they shouldn't, bending under the weight of curiosity. When the townsfolk pried them up, expecting maybe a cellar or a stash of stolen goods, they found instead the sickly perfume of rot, thick, unmistakable, clinging to their throats. Shovels went down into the dirt, and then the truth clawed its way back into daylight. Bodies. Not one, not two rows of them. Men with their skulls crushed clean through. Women whose faces still seemed to carry the last scream. Children too small to make sense of why the ground had turned into a grave. The people of Kansas were used to hardship. Prairie winds, sudden storms, the unforgiving land. But what they uncovered on that spring day in 1873 wasn't weather or famine. It was human hunger. A different kind of famine, one with a face. 4 faces, actually. A family of settlers who were supposed to be just another stop on the endless trail westward. Except their hospitality came with an execution plan. The cabin was small, unassuming, almost quaint. A canvas wall hanging separated the front parlor from the kitchen. Guests would sit at the table, chatting politely with the Bender family. And as they leaned forward, drawn in by conversation, someone standing behind that canvas would raise a hammer. A single blow to the skull. The guests never saw it coming. Their body would then be dropped through a trapdoor on the floor, their valuables stripped, their lives erased as efficiently as if they'd never existed. But what froze everyone to their marrow wasn't just the brutality. It was the ordinariness. The Benders looked like everyone else. Farmers, immigrants, a family chasing the same dream of survival. They baked bread, sold goods, chatted with neighbors. And then, after a day's work, they killed, over and over, until the soil around their cabin became a ledger of atrocities. Each body an entry. The newspapers called them the Demon Family. People whispered they weren't even human, but spirits disguised as settlers, drawn straight from some folktale about crossroads bargains. To this day, nobody knows how many people fell victim at that cursed house. Some say a dozen, others say closer to 20. The final count may be buried deeper than the bodies. The image that lingers, that won't leave your head, is this: a table set for dinner, a family smiling, a chair waiting for you. Behind the curtain, someone with a hammer waiting too. Kansas in the 1870s was a paradox in motion. Wide skies promising freedom, prairie winds whispering opportunity. Yet beneath it all, a chaos barely stitched together by law. Independence, Kansas, the nearest town to where the Benders made their home, was a place of wagons creaking through mud, cattle bawling in the stockyards, and strangers passing through like phantoms. It was frontier America, raw and unfinished, where the government's reach was thin, and people carried their own justice tucked into belts. Imagine it. Travelers in droves, hundreds of them, chasing the promise of land, fortune, or just a reset button for lives already squandered elsewhere. They trudged down the Osage Trail, later to be called the Santa Fe Trail, a road that cut across an ocean of grass like a scar. You could vanish out there, swallowed by tall weeds or bandits, and no one would ask questions. Outlaws, runaways, con men, all of them bled into the prairie soil, along with good, God-fearing settlers. Kansas was less a state and more a gamble with the horizon. The Benders chose their patch of earth carefully. 10 miles outside Independence, they set up a modest cabin near the trail, a convenient location for weary travelers seeking a hot meal and rest. Their home doubled as a general store and a stopping place for stagecoaches, which gave them an endless supply of victims to choose from. This wasn't random wilderness violence. This was business. Efficient, premeditated, and masked with hospitality. And yet, life around them wasn't all shadows. Neighbors plowed their fields. Children played along the dusty roads. And church gatherings carried the hymns of people desperate to carve sanctity out of untamed land. But it was a thin veneer. Scratch the surface, and you'd see suspicion everywhere. Settlers eyeing newcomers with equal parts curiosity and dread. Superstition thrived in the soil. Whispers of witchcraft, curses, and devils that roamed in human skin. It's important to remember this wasn't a land with a rule of law and neatly outlined morality. It was survival. If your cow wandered into another man's field, if your horse was stolen, if your son disappeared. Well, sometimes you prayed, sometimes you begged, and sometimes you buried the evidence yourself. The newspaper sold Kansas as the promised land, but anyone who lived there knew the truth. It was as close to a fever dream as it gets. Golden opportunity rotting at the edges with danger. And into this perfect storm of desperation and lawlessness stepped the Benders, a family who dressed like settlers, talked like settlers, tilled the earth like settlers. Except their real harvest wasn't wheat. It was human lives. Let's talk about the Benders themselves, the so-called demon family. For figures, like chess pieces arranged on a board, where every move ended in blood. They called themselves John, Elvira, John Jr., and Kate. But names on the frontier were slippery things. Aliases, half-truths, covers stitched together to hide the cracks in their lives. The father, John Sr., or Pa, was a grim, heavy man with a thick German accent, barely able to form an English sentence. His neighbors described him as brooding, with the look of a man who'd rather be anywhere but human company. He mostly stayed silent, and when he did speak, it was guttural, almost animal. His wife, Elvira, was no softer, sharp-tongued, hostile, rumored to be dabbling in occult rituals. People said she muttered under her breath, spat at anyone who crossed her, and carried a permanent scowl like a scar across her face. John Jr., lanky and awkward, tried for charm but rarely hit the mark. He laughed too loud, at the wrong moments, in a way that made folks inch back. His attempts at friendliness didn't erase the unease he spread. And then there was Kate, the face of the operation. Young, striking, intelligent in ways the rest of the family wasn't. She called herself a healer, a spiritualist, a medium who claimed to converse with the dead. Flyers went around advertising her lectures on free love and mysticism. Travelers who might have skipped a rough tavern meal were drawn in by her beauty, her promises of guidance, her supposed powers to see the unseen. This wasn't just a family, it was a lure. Each member played their role. Pa and Ma provided the backbone of menace. John Jr. provided noise, a distraction. And Kate, she was a magnet. She drew them in, smiling across the dinner table, letting men believe they were lucky to have stumbled into her orbit. And while their attention was on her, the rest of the family was already deciding their fate. What makes the Benders different from the usual catalog of frontier killers is their cohesion. Most predators on the trail were solitary, desperados, gang members who eventually turned on one another. But the Benders, they killed together. They lived in routine, in a kind of domestic choreography of death. Set the table, pour the drinks, distract the guest, lift the hammer, drag the body, bury the evidence. Night after night, as regular as milking a cow. You look at their portraits today, what little exists, and the faces are blank, unspectacular. And maybe that's the most horrifying detail. They weren't monsters in any visible sense. They looked like neighbors, like the family down the road. And yet, beneath the thin fabric of civility, they were building one of the darkest reputations in frontier history. The story doesn't begin with a massacre. It begins with whispers. Missing men, vanishing wagons, horses showing up without riders, still saddled, still tethered with belongings, just no owner in sight. On the Osage Trail, this wasn't unusual. The road itself had a reputation for swallowing travelers whole. Bandits prowled it. Storms rolled in like hammers, and illness could drop a man faster than a bullet. But then the pattern grew too neat. It started with a single name, Dr. William York. In March of 1873, York set out on horseback to visit friends near Independence. A physician well-respected, well-connected. Unlike nameless drifters, York had family, powerful family. His brothers included a colonel and a Kansas state senator. So when York didn't return, silence was not an option. The neighbors recalled seeing him near the Bender property, stopping in for a meal, perhaps, or lodging for the night. After that, nothing, gone, as if the prairie itself had swallowed him. Except the prairie doesn't hold grudges. The land doesn't selectively consume. People do. And here's the part that tightens the stomach. York wasn't the first. Other travelers had disappeared before him. Men carrying cash, families with wagons, even a young girl. Their names circulated like smoke through the settlements, often dismissed as accidents, robberies, or runaways. The frontier chewed people up every day. One more lost soul was easy to excuse. But York's case was different. His disappearance lit a fuse. His family demanded answers. Soon, the settlers along the Osage Trail began piecing together old suspicions. Who had last seen that trader from Independence? Who remembered the peddler who passed by weeks earlier? Over and over, the stories led back to one place, the Bender cabin, a place where travelers were welcomed, fed, and then apparently vanished. Think about the psychological weight of that realization. These weren't bandits ambushing people under moonlight. These were neighbors offering bread and stew. If your stomach churns at the thought of eating a meal under a roof that doubles as a slaughterhouse, good. It should. That was the moment the prairie stopped being just dangerous wilderness and revealed itself as something worse, a stage for predators who wore the mask of hospitality. The missing didn't leave notes or trails or bodies at first, just absence, an echo where life used to be. And nothing haunts a small community more than absence, because absence forces a question: where did they go? Who took them? And when will it happen again? By spring of 1873, the frontier was buzzing with paranoia. Families who had once traded goods and gossip with the Benders now shifted uncomfortably when their cabin came up in conversation. Too many coincidences piled onto one another like storm clouds. Too many horses found wandering without riders. Too many men who had last been seen tipping their hats at the Bender door. The neighbors tried to laugh it off. People vanish all the time out here, they'd say. But laughter doesn't hold when the missing list includes your doctor, your cousin, your friend. And then there was Kate Bender. Oh, Kate. She kept up her performances, claiming she could summon spirits for grieving families, offering seances to those desperate for answers. Imagine the cruel irony. Sitting in that cabin, listening to her pretend to contact the dead, while the dead themselves were rotting on the floorboards only a few feet away. Rumors mutated like a fever. Some swore they'd seen ghostly figures walking the trail at night. Others muttered that the Benders were witches, feeding travelers to Satan himself. And while the supernatural rumors swirled, the real evidence, boots half buried in the dirt, blood stains that didn't quite wash out of wagon wheels, kept whispering the same truth. This wasn't folklore. This was happening. The real tipping point came when search parties started combing the prairie for York. His brothers weren't about to let the matter die quietly. They questioned settlers, interrogated innkeepers, and at every turn, the trail pointed back to one location. Witnesses swore York had dined with the Benders before he vanished. Yet when asked, the family smiled politely and insisted he had left, safe and sound. Their calmness was infuriating, unsettling, too perfect. Here's the thing. Killers rarely imagine the scale of the net that grief casts. For the Benders, murdering nameless drifters was one thing. But killing a man whose family wielded political power? That was arrogance. And arrogance has a habit of cracking masks wide open. Still, for weeks, nothing happened. The Benders went about their business, selling dry goods, baking bread, offering hospitality. And the settlers around them went about theirs, though with eyes sharper and hearts colder. A terrible quietness settled over the trail. Everyone was waiting, though no one could name exactly what for. It's almost poetic in a grotesque way. A family of killers seated each night at their table, dining inches above their victims, while outside, suspicion grew like thunder in the distance. A storm was coming, and when it broke, it would drag every secret they'd buried straight into the light. When Dr. York's brothers demanded action, the frontier shrugged off its dust and finally looked toward the Benders' cabin with sharpened suspicion. Lawmen, neighbors, and curious settlers gathered like vultures circling a carcass. What had been gossip now hardened into inquiry. The Benders, cornered by the stares of a community that was beginning to add two and two together, clung to their performance. Meals offered, smiles painted on, Kate still whispering about spirits that longed to speak. The theories grew louder than the prairie winds. Some whispered the Benders were just thieves who robbed unlucky travelers. Others said they were part of a larger cult, a network of killers feeding the prairie with human sacrifices. More than one preacher proclaimed it was God's wrath, a punishment sent in the form of a family possessed. And then there were the practical men who simply followed the money. The missing always seemed to be those carrying cash, wagons full of goods, or horses worth stealing. Sheriff groups started poking around the Benderland. They found little things. Boot tracks vanishing near the cabin, broken bits of jewelry half buried in the dirt, blood stains in places that shouldn't have been bloody at all. But still, the Benders smiled. They knew the advantage of the frontier. Unless someone caught you red-handed, proof was slippery, as hard to hold as prairie smoke. Kate, meanwhile, leaned into her role. She told her neighbors she could help them find the missing through her seances. Some believed her. Some even paid her. Picture it. Families desperate for closure, handing coin to the very person who'd helped orchestrate their loved one's death. That's not just cruelty. That's theater. That's manipulation so bold it becomes art. But cracks began to show. Too many missing men, too many odd excuses. When York's brothers pressed harder, a grim consensus began to form. The Bender property had to be searched properly. There were whispers of organizing a town meeting. Some say Kate herself was invited and tried to deflect suspicion with her charm, but the air had already curdled. The community was tired of missing sons, missing fathers, missing friends. Theories collided. Were the Benders part of a traveling band of killers who used way stations to harvest victims? Were they immigrants carrying some old-world curse? Or were they simply opportunists who found murder more profitable than farming? Each explanation seemed too much and too little at once. Because no matter the theory, the ground kept whispering beneath the floorboards. And soon, that whisper would roar. The meeting at Harmony Grove Schoolhouse was supposed to be civil, a gathering of settlers to address the growing unease. But civility doesn't last long when people's kin have vanished. Eyewitnesses later swore that suspicion hung in that room thicker than tobacco smoke. The Benders were there, sitting quietly, pretending to blend in. But everyone's eyes kept sliding toward them, like a collective instinct no one dared voice. Plans were made to search every homestead along the trail, starting with the Benders. It was agreed in that creaking schoolhouse that no cabin, barn, or cellar would escape inspection. It was the kind of announcement that forces masks to shatter. And then, like ghosts, the Benders vanished. Days passed, then weeks. Neighbors began to realize something was off. The Bender land looked abandoned. Their cattle wandered untended. The cabin stood silent. When finally a search party forced the door open, what they found was not a family home, but a stage struck mid-performance. Dishes still sat on the shelves. Food supplies remained. The house hadn't been emptied, only abandoned in haste. And then came the horror. Investigators pried up the floorboards near the table. The very table where travelers had eaten, laughed, prayed. Beneath it, a trapdoor, a dark, narrow pit reeking of decay. They began to dig. First one body, then another, men, women, children. Their skulls caved in, throats cut, their remains dumped like refuse. Some were half buried in the orchard. The soil churned into a grotesque harvest of bones. The bodies spoke a silent testimony, one hammer blow at a time. These weren't crimes of passion. These weren't chaotic killings. They were methodical, ritualistic in their precision. Seat the victim at the guest of honor chair, positioned against the canvas. Distract them with Kate's smile. Strike from behind with the hammer. Drag through the trapdoor. Finish the job with a knife. Repeat. And suddenly, all the whispers, all the rumors, every twitch of suspicion coalesced into a singular, brutal truth. The Benders weren't settlers at all. They were executioners with a homestead as their stage. The turning point wasn't just the discovery of bodies. It was a realization that the Benders had been living among them the entire time, attending gatherings, shaking hands, exchanging goods, while the soil at their feet grew fat with corpses. Civilization itself felt counterfeit in that moment. What good were neighbors if a family like that could thrive in the middle of it? The breakdown was total. The prairie wasn't dangerous because of storms, wolves, or outlaws. It was dangerous because evil had learned how to smile, serve stew, and ask you about your travels before caving your skull in. Here's the part where history should provide clean lines, arrests, trials, punishments neatly recorded. But with the Benders, the trail dissolves into fog. The search party discovered the bodies. Yes, they confirmed the method. Yes, but the family themselves? Gone. Evaporated. Some claimed they fled east by wagon, disappearing into forests of Missouri. Others swore they were spotted boarding a train under assumed names. A few insisted vigilantes had caught up with them and delivered frontier justice in silence, hanging them from a tree and burying them where no one would ever find them. But no graves marked Bender were ever proven. No official execution recorded. They simply slipped into mythology of the frontier, half fact, half phantom. Theories multiplied like flies. Was Kate truly the ringleader, using her seances and beauty to lure men into their final supper? Was Pa the Brute the one who swung the hammer most often? Was Ma the architect, the cold strategist behind their routine? Or was John Jr. more than just an awkward distraction? Was he the one who held them together in their blood-stained unity? Each story rearranged the family roles like a deck of cursed cards. Even the body count never quite settled. 11 graves are confirmed, but locals swore the tally was higher. Travelers who never reached their destinations, wagons that never reappeared, letters that ceased mid-journey. All became potential Bender victims. Some historians put the number at 20. Others whisper it was far more. that the Osage Trail was a conveyor belt of human offerings swallowed whole by a family with a cellar for stomach. And here's the most unsettling question. Did they stop? Did they vanish into new names, new towns, new homes with fresh floorboards to pry up decades later? Or did they fragment, scattering into obscurity, Pa digging ditches under another alias, Kate performing seances in some city salon, laughing at men who never guess her history? The lack of resolution is what gnaws hardest. It's one thing to unearth a family of killers. It's another to never know if they kept killing elsewhere, if the hammer and the trapdoor were merely traded for new tools. A clean ending would have been comforting. Gallows, justice served, the prairie purged. But history rarely grants such neat closures. Instead, the Benders linger as shadows, questions dressed in human skin. The earth gave up their crimes, but never their faces at the end of the story. And maybe that's the truest horror. The killers got away. When the cabin was stripped bare, when the graves were filled back in, when the search party scattered, what remained wasn't just a crime scene. It was a rupture in the collective psyche of the frontier. People began to see danger not in the wilds, but in their neighbors. A family offering bread could just as easily be offering you a chair at your own execution. The myth of prairie innocence died in that orchard alongside the victims. The newspapers feasted on the story, painting the Benders as supernatural fiends, demons masquerading as humans. And honestly, who could blame them? The facts were horrific enough, but the lack of closure demanded embellishment. Ghost stories spread across Kansas like prairie fire. Tales of travelers hearing phantom hammer blows echoing across the plains, or seeing Kate's figure wandering at night, lantern in hand, searching for another guest to charm. Children were warned, behave, or the bloody Benders will come for you. The legacy slithered into folklore. Every missing person in Kansas for years afterward was blamed on the Benders, whether it made sense or not. Some believed the family had become an immortal curse, moving from town to town under new identities, forever feeding on trust. Others turned them into cautionary tales about greed, lust, or spiritual corruption. In a land desperate for morality plays, the Benders became the ultimate bogeyman, and practically, their crimes forced communities to rethink trust itself. In stage stops and boarding houses fell under sharper scrutiny. Lawmen became less forgiving of strangers passing through. The prairie hardened. Hospitality shriveled under suspicion. The Benders taught the frontier a brutal lesson. Evil doesn't always wear a mask of banditry. Sometimes it smiles across a dinner table. Their legacy also infected pop culture. Penny dreadfuls, dime novels, even whispered stories in taverns spread their legend far beyond Kansas. They were cast as vampires, witches, cannibals, whatever monstrosity the audience craved. But at the core, the truth remained darker. They were just people, ordinary settlers, indistinguishable from everyone else. And maybe that ordinariness is what seared their stories so deeply into America's imagination. Because long after the cabin rotted into the soil, the name Bloody Benders still made blood run cold. Not because they were monsters, but because they proved monsters don't need claws or fangs. Just a hammer, a smile, and a table set for supper. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the last sounds heard by those who sat at that cursed table. The scrape of a chair against wood, the clink of a cup against the plate. Kate's voice low, magnetic, asking some trivial question about their journey, their families, their hopes. And then silence, a silence heavy enough to make the heart race, followed by the sound of footsteps behind the curtain, then the hammer falling, turning hope into horror in less than a heartbeat. The Bloody Benders remind us that history is not just a ledger of wars and laws. It's a graveyard of forgotten dinners, of strangers who vanish into the belly of the prairie, their scars stitched into America's skin. A reminder that evil doesn't march in with banners. It slides a bowl of stew across the table and smiles. What unsettles me most isn't the brutality. Brutality is common. It's that we never got their ending. No courtroom, no rope, no confession scratched into a cell wall. They simply dissolve into the mythos of the frontier, leaving only questions gnawing at the bones of certainty. Did they live out their days under different names? Did Kate keep holding seances, charming men into rooms they would never leave? Did Ma and Pa sink into anonymity, their hands forever itching for hammers they'd lost? And here's the cruelest truth. Maybe that's why they still haunt us. Because our brains crave resolution, and the Benders denied us one. They left us stranded at that table, forever waiting for the hammer to fall. So the next time you sit with strangers, whether in a roadside diner, a borrowed room, or some warm house in the middle of nowhere, remember the prairie, the cabin, the orchard. Remember the trapdoor under floorboards. And ask yourself, how well do you really know the hands that serve you supper? Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have. And I hope to see you all again in the next case.